3-bet pots are some of the most challenging post-flop situations in tournaments. The ranges are narrower, the pots are bigger, and our entire stack will often be at risk. If you have trouble with these spots, don't worry. This video is here to guide you. Let's dive in. Before we dive into the topic, please do take the time to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us to keep bringing you the content you like here on YouTube. Before we get too technical, let's discuss some of the major challenges inherent to navigating 3-bet pots in tournaments specifically, since cash game 3-bet pots are going to look very different in terms of both ranges and SPRs. First of all, we have to deal with the fact that there's a lot of fluctuation in what tournament 3-bet ranges look like. At deeper stacks, we'll see some fairly linear 3-bet constructions, such as the range you see here on the left, which is from a small blind versus under the gun 80 big blind spot. Once we get shallower, we'll see a lot more polarization in the ranges, such as the range on the right, which is from a button versus big blind spot at 40 big blinds. The same variation also exists within the ranges which call versus 3-bets. We'll sometimes call with very narrow pair-heavy ranges, such as the under the gun versus under the gun 1 80 big blind range on the left, and we'll sometimes call a lot wider, with more suited hands and a lot of our pairs 4-bet jamming pre-flop, like the range on the right, which comes from a button versus small blind spot at 40 big blinds. Naturally, these discrepancies which exist within the ranges will often mean that certain board textures can play out very differently, and that's before we even start to consider the impact of our opponents potentially employing flawed or less than optimal ranges. Secondly, we also have to consider the wildly varying SPRs which exist in 3-bet pots. These SPRs are heavily influenced by the exact preflop sizings we and our opponents choose, as well as, obviously, the starting stack sizes. If we start fairly shallow and our opponent uses a larger preflop sizing like 2.5 big blinds, then an out of position 3-bet to 10 big blinds would leave us at an SPR of only 1.33 going to the flop if we get called. On the other hand, we could easily be at an SPR of more than 13 if we're playing 200 big blinds deep and the sizings are smaller, while something in the middle would leave us at an SPR of around 3.5. Clearly, all these various types of pots are going to play out very differently and require us to adhere to very different stack-off thresholds. At the lower SPR, we would only need roughly 36% equity in order to stack off, while that number jumps to just over 48% at the higher SPR. These thresholds are going to vastly alter the level of aggression we can justify in our strategy, and they're also going to magnify the importance of concepts like nut advantage and overall equity advantage within the ranges which arrive at the flop. We'll talk more about that later on. Finally, it would be a mistake to ignore the impact of both ICM and exploitative considerations on our strategy in 3-bet pots. ICM will almost always alter our 3-bet strategies and responses very significantly, and even though calculating ICM-based post-flop solutions isn't something we can easily do just yet, in future we'll be able to use GTO Wizard AI to account for all kinds of variables like ICM. We're also looking forward to being able to node lock our opponent's strategy and explore the impact of pre-flop mistakes on our approach in 3-bet pots. However, for the time being, we're going to focus purely on the theory guiding our strategies in these situations. Look out for upcoming videos on our channel for some exploration of exploitative approaches. So with all this in mind, let's begin by establishing some basic principles which will be important in building our 3-bet pot strategies from the ground up, starting with our approach when we're the 3-better. Our first port of call when building our overall c-bet strategy is to establish our frequencies. In other words, getting a sense of how aggressive we can afford to be. The good news is that the answer here is relatively simple. We can afford to be very aggressive in 3-bet pots since we will almost always have a stronger range than our opponent on most boards, and there will often be certain nut hands which are not present at all in our opponent's range. In particular, we're almost always going to be able to justify a high level of aggression when we're in position post-flop, as we can see from this chart. I've picked out our c-bet frequencies for a variety of spots from the GTO Wizard solution library. If we focus on the in-position spots first, we can see that there's actually a remarkable amount of consistency in the c-bet frequencies. At every stack size from 30 big blinds up to 100 big blinds, we're c-betting between 80 and 90% of the time when in position in 3-bet pots, and the positional formation doesn't really have much of an effect on the equation. The primary reason for this aspect is, in an equilibrium scenario, both players are already pre-adapting their ranges to cater to post-flop play. If the in-position player was able to c-bet 100% of the time on all boards, then it would be a sign that the out-of-position player's range for calling the 3-bet was probably too weak, but the solver isn't going to make such a mistake. Likewise, the solver isn't going to 3-bet a hyper-aggressive range from in-position, since that would force it to check the flop at a much higher rate. When we're out of position, however, there are some other factors to consider. As you can see in the chart, our out-of-position c-bet frequency in 3-bet pots does drop fairly significantly when stacks are greater than around 60 big blinds. This is because our ability to realize equity from out of position is heavily dependent upon the SPR. and the higher the SPR, the more passively we're forced to play from out of position as a result. The other interesting phenomenon in the out of position spots is that our c-bet frequency when 3-betting out of the big blind is lower than when we're in the small blind. The reason for this has a lot to do with the construction of our big blind 3-bet range. We're a lot more polarized when we 3-bet from the big blind since we'll be defending through a call with most of our range pre-flop. This makes our range a bit weaker on a lot of board textures, and so we're a little bit less able to show aggression across a variety of post-flop spots. Much like when we're in position, the positional formation won't alter our out-of-position frequencies very much, so I haven't included a comparison here. We're already accounting for the position of the open raiser when we construct our pre-flop 3-bet range. Next, let's look at a snapshot of our raising and check-raising strategies as the pre-flop defender. We're focused on the 25% c-bet size, since this is the most common size across all boards, both in theory and in practice. This equation is also surprisingly simple for familiar reasons. At equilibrium, the c-better is always going to moderate their c-bet frequency to prevent the defender from being able to easily raise at a very high rate. One thing that is noteworthy, however, is the fact that we still have a roughly 10% raising frequency from in position across all boards. This is a part of the game tree a lot of players ignore or miss. Try to remember the last time you c-bet from out of position in a 3-bet pot and got raised on the flop. It doesn't happen very often. It's also worth remembering that we're raising more often at shallower stacks. This is because the equity threshold needed for us to get all in profitably is much lower, as we mentioned earlier, and so we can raise with a wider range of hands. Next, let's move on from looking at frequencies to looking at bet sizing. Using the cutoff versus low jack formation as a guideline, here's what our in-position sizing structure looks like. As you can see, it's heavily dominated by smaller and medium bet sizings, with the medium sizing beginning to disappear as we get down below 50 big blinds. There is some large betting taking place at deeper stacks, and even some overbetting at shallower stacks, but this mostly represents a grouping of specific spots where our range prefers to get all in either on the flop or turn as opposed to playing all 3 streets. If we switch to looking at out of position in the small blind versus hijack formation, some of the same trends are visible, except we become a lot less inclined to use smaller sizings at shallower stacks. We're making a lot more effort to get stacks in across 1 or 2 streets, as opposed to playing out of position all the way to the river. By contrast, when we're deep enough that we're likely going to have to play all 3 streets no matter what, we're a little more content to bet smaller on the flop, since our opponent's pre-flop calling range is wider and less trap-heavy, and since we might be less inclined to bloat pots unnecessarily. To summarize, we're going to have a high c-bet frequency across all in-position spots in 3-bet pots, between 80 to 90% of the time. When we're out of position, we're still going to be aggressive, in particular from the small blind, but we're going to slow down a little when stacks are deeper. As the defender, we're going to do more raising at shallower stacks and more raising from out of position than in position, but we are still going to have some aggressive raising strategies in all spots. In terms of bet sizing, we're going to stick with mostly small and medium sizes from in position, with some larger sizes coming in when we're deeper stacked, or when we're out of position and looking to play a 2-street or 1-street game. So now that we've established our basic principles, let's build out some heuristics for how to approach evaluating different types of board textures. Since we know that the most common approach in 3-bet pots is for the 3-better to employ a high-frequency small bet strategy, we're going to focus on identifying the board textures where we either have to significantly decrease our c-bet frequency, increase our sizing, or both. We'll also identify some of the rare board textures where we might consider donk betting as the out-of-position defender. First, let's discuss one particular category of board textures where our strategy might look a little outside the box. The JTx boards where X is an 8 or lower, with either a flush draw or rainbow texture. On these boards, one of our primary strategies at many different stack depths, both in position and out of position, is going to be to simply shove all in even for multiple times the size of the pot. As you can see from this chart, we're not using this approach very much at deep stacks because the SPR is still too high. But as soon as we get down to around 60 big blinds out of position or 40 big blinds in position, the strategy of just jamming the flop on the JTx boards becomes very reasonable. It will often be supplemented by a smaller bet with some other portions of our range, as we'll see, but let's start by examining why this strategy actually works here. Here's a sim for the Jack-10-8 flush draw board at 40 big blind stacks in the low jack versus under the gun formation. The 3-bet ranges are quite tight in this formation, so it's a good example of why the all-in strategy works well. You can see that the all-in size is by far the most common size for the low jack here. If we switch to the actions chart, you can see by far it's the most prevalent. But without going too far into range construction, let's dig into the range comparison here to try to understand why this strategy actually works. Firstly, check out that top category of best hands. neither player has many hands in this bracket here, mostly because the board is quite dynamic. If we look at the good hands category, though, we can see that the low jack has a huge advantage in this department. More than 60% of their range is in this region of 50 to 75% equity. And they have literally no trash hands here at all. No trash hands whatsoever. On the other hand, almost half of the under the gun range is in the weak hands category right here, between 25 to 50% equity. And this creates a situation where a lot of the low jack's hands are somewhat vulnerable. Imagine a hand like Black Pocket Kings here. If we go back to the strategy and we look at equity, Black Pocket Kings has 65.5% equity. But there are obviously a large number of turn cards on which its ability to realize equity is going to drastically decrease. So it would heavily prefer to realize that equity right now by being all in. By contrast, if we flip it around to look at the under the gun player's range, and we look at a hand like Pocket Sevens, this hand has about 35% equity here, but it has no real ability to navigate multiple streets versus aggression. This hand is heavily going to prefer to see the low jack check back. And there are a lot of other hands in this category in the under the gun player's range, something like Ace-8 suited, Ace-9, Ace-10, a lot of this stuff that has one pair or a mediocre draw, something like that, smaller pocket pairs. They really want to see a check back. And by using the all-in jam strategy, if we flick back to the strategy tab and then we go over here and look at what happens when the all-in jam occurs, we can see that the low jack is able to create indifference for a pretty big chunk of the under the gun player's range here. And if we highlight this weak hands category, we see that this category is splitting almost 50-50 between calling and folding. And if we go over here to see strategy plus equity, we can see that hands as strong as something like King Jack of Diamonds here are actually mixing a tiny amount of folding. And then stuff like King Queen of Spades that has two overcards, an open-ender, and a backdoor flush draw that has 35% equity is actually folding. And there's plenty of other hands like that too. Ace Queen suited here, Ace Queen of Spades, open-ender, backdoor nut flush draw has 40% equity and it's actually forced to fold to the jam, which massively benefits the low jack. It's really going to benefit that good hands portion of their range that we saw here, which if we clear the filter is still a pretty big portion of their range, as you can see, 60.7%. And if we look at how the low jack actually constructs that all-in shove, we're going to start to see why this strategy functions particularly well. So if we go over to strategy and we look at the all-in shove and we just focus on the summary here, we start to look at which hands are shoving at the highest frequencies, you can see that it's a lot of King Jack type hands, Ace Queen, a lot of stuff in this region. We can see that hands like over here, if we go to Ace King or Ace Queen with a heart, so Ace of Hearts King, Ace X King of Hearts, Queens, Ace Jack, offsuit here, aces without a heart. A lot of these hands are heavily prioritizing the all-in jam as their strategy. And even some hands like Queen 10 and King 10 suited of spades, hands like that, are also in there. Now you might be wondering, why would we shove King 10 for value here? And if you are, then you're right to wonder, because the truth is it's not entirely a value shove, but it's also not entirely a bluff either. How is that possible? Well, let me show you. If we examine the under the gun response to the jam, we can see that shoving King 10 does sometimes get called by worse, because all 10-9 suited right here and all pocket nines is calling, as well as 8-7 of hearts, which is a pair plus flush draw, technically worse than King 10. However, it also manages to get some better combos to fold, like Ace-10 of Diamonds, Ace-10 of Clubs, right? So we're actually achieving both at once here. We're getting a few calls from some worse hands, and we're getting the occasional fold from something better, which is a huge benefit. And even though this seems kind of too good to be true, it actually does happen sometimes in certain spots, and particularly these Jack 10x boards are a pretty decent example of this, although Jack 10-9 is a bit of an exception there because of the King Queen. It's created by the fact that the straight and flush draws are so important and so prevalent on this board. Ace-10 without diamonds has to fold because the lack of a straight or flush draw massively reduces its equity, while 10-9 is forced to call because it has a straight draw. So 10-9 here, if we flip and look at the equity, 10-9 has 50% equity, can never fold to any size. Ace-10 of diamonds only has about 38% equity. So massive difference between Ace-10 and 10-9 here. If we now look at the same board in a different formation, if we go to small blind versus hijack at 60 big blinds, so we'll just take a quick look there, Jack 10, 8, there we go. We will see that from out of position, the strategy of just all-in shoving is going to be pretty prevalent as well. You can see here the all-in and the large bet, which is basically an all-in, are both happening with a pretty high frequency. And it's the same principle at play here. We're seeing that the equity denial and the power to just take advantage of these good hands and leverage them against all of this weak hands region that villain might have is a huge driving factor behind our strategy on this board. Now, we could spend hours following the logic of each individual combo for these spots because it does get really complex, but for now, it's enough just to know that we want to be jamming these Jack 10x flops quite a lot, and that this is a pretty consistent trend across a lot of formations, especially when stacks get shallower and or we're out of position. Our construction is usually going to be built around a lot of those high equity but vulnerable hands and draws, plus a lot of that stuff that occasionally has the power to get called by worse but also fold better, things like that. And we're really putting a lot of pressure on all those hands that have about 35, 40-ish% equity. And in this kind of a formation, that's going to be a lot of hands on this board. So this is one category of board textures that requires a fairly unique sort of a strategy. Our next heuristic is for rainbow paired boards without an ace. And it's primarily geared towards deeper stacks, but does apply to some extent at shallower stacks as well. It relates to the fact that while most players' instinct is to bet smaller on paired boards, which is what we might usually do from in position in single raised pots, these boards are actually pretty appropriate for using larger sizes in 3-bet pots. Take a look at this table here. It shows our frequencies for betting half pot or greater on this type of board for various stacks and formations. Evidently, the larger bets start to fade away a little once we get below 50 big blinds in position or 30 big blinds out of position, but they can be very prevalent at deeper stacks, particularly in the narrower range formations where we're against a under-the-gun raiser. Let's take a look at an example of such a board to see how and why such a bet functions well. Our example is going to be Jack Deuce Deuce Rainbow at 100 big blinds in the button versus under-the-gun formation. I've used GTO Wizard AI to test the EVs of various single sizing strategies in this spot, and as you can see, it's a board where a range bet of 25% pot, which might be a strategy many players would employ here, is actually significantly outperformed by larger sizings. Even betting 100% of pot achieves higher EV here than betting 25% of pot. Although a sizing as large as that would now force us to check certain hands and reduce our betting frequency to below 80%. However, if we look at the middling sizings, we can see that the highest EV size is actually about half pot. The 61% sizing you can see listed here is our geometric sizing, a sizing used to allow us to bet the same percentage of the pot on all remaining streets, with the river bet being all in. And that has very similar EV to the half pot bet. It does technically force us to check around 2 to 3% of the time, but in practice that's not really going to be necessary. I also tested the sizings in between 50% and 61% of pot, and our betting frequency didn't dip below 100% until the sizing hit 58% or higher. But why is all of this happening? Why would we want to bet half pot or greater on a board with no draws? Let's look at the reasoning. So here is that Jack Deuce Deuce spot, and if we pull up the range comparison here, we can see that as the button player, we have a massive nut advantage on this board. We have 34.5% best hands to 3.2%. So while both players can have pocket jacks and only under the gun can have quad deuces, we can have kings and aces almost in full, as well as a lot of strong Jack X hands and strong pocket pairs, while villain's range contains a lot of pairs between 3s and 8s, as well as a lot of ace high, meaning they have a lot of hands in this weak hands region. And note also that neither player possesses any trips here. The equation is going to be slightly different on boards where the pair on board isn't the deuce and some trips are in the ranges, but it won't change so much that our entire strategy alters. Neither player has a deuce in this spot. Our nut advantage here can be leveraged to put a lot of those 3s through 8s and ace high hands in a very tough spot. In fact, it's so significant that if we look at villain's response to the half-pot sizing, and we take a note of where the indifference thresholds are, we can see that all these pairs between 8s and 3s are actually pretty much indifferent versus this size. They are primarily folding, mixing a small amount of calls and raises in some cases, but for the most part, they're in very, very tough spots. Despite the fact that if we check the equity, a hand like 8s actually has close to 50% equity. They have about 48% or so in this spot. Even 9s has almost exactly 50%, and that hand is not loving this spot either. It's calling, but it's actually folding about a tiny, tiny fraction of the time. So even 9s with 50% equity is in very big trouble here. These hands are just going to have too much trouble defending on future streets if they continue against a bet. That's what's happening here. There are almost no good runouts, even in a spot where we're essentially range betting the flop for a fairly big size. The geometric size here, or something roughly equivalent, basically narrows villain's flop continuing range to being very heavy on Jack X hands, as you can see here, which is great for both our strong value hands, which are getting maximum value, and our multi-street bluffing candidates as well. Plus, we're also forcing villain to raise the flop at some rate because our bet sizing isn't that big that they can just play call or fold easily, and that, of course, puts them in a lot of tough spots as well. By contrast, against a quarter pot bet here, villain is not forced to play particularly aggressively. They're still able to get away with just calling a lot and not really raising a ton of hands. And you can see that there's a big difference here in how often these pocket pairs are able to continue. They are getting a slightly easier spot against a quarter pot bet, even though the quarter pot bet does still make life tough for them. It doesn't quite make it as tough as the half pot bet does. So the general conclusion here really is that on a lot of these board textures, because our opponent's calling ranges are quite often going to be heavy on pocket pairs and ace highs, the small bet sizings are not going to create indifference for those hands as easily as some slightly larger bet sizes. So geometric strategies and sizings of half pot, 3/4 pot, etc., depending on the stacks, can actually be very, very effective here to put your opponents in a lot of tough spots across multiple streets. So this is something to really keep in mind for these board textures, because they do play a lot differently to how single raise pots would play out on the same boards. Next, let's look at a very interesting category of boards, the donk bet boards. These are generally the boards with a possible flopped straight available and a high card of 9, 8, or 7. And the donk betting trend is most evident in tight range formations like under the gun versus under the gun 1, where the 3-better doesn't have a lot of board coverage on these flops. It might be fairly intuitive as to why these boards are donk bet boards. After all, they're very scary boards for the 3-better, and a lot of the 3-better's strongest hands generally won't want to play big pots. It might be reasonable to say that any board where pocket aces doesn't necessarily want to get all in could feasibly become a donk bet board. But since stack sizes do matter, we'll focus it on the connected middle card boards for now. This graphic shows us the frequency of donk bets on these boards in each of the 3 formations. As you can see, it's occurring a lot more often in the scenarios where the pre-flop caller of the 3-bet is under the gun. This is largely because of the higher density of pocket pairs in the raise calling range, which flop sets. When the pre-flop ranges are wider, such as in the hijack versus button scenario, the pre-flop caller won't be quite so weighted towards this region of hands. We can also see that stack sizes play a big role, but this is mostly because they will dictate how much board coverage the 3-better is going to have on these flops, and how happy they are to get it in with overpairs at that stack size. Once stack sizes are shallower, they're less concerned about getting it in, and once stack sizes are deep enough in certain formations, they're 3-betting more suited connectors pre-flop, so the pre-flop caller's nut advantage is slightly reduced. Let's take a look at an example of one of these boards. I've chosen 8-7-6 with a flush draw in the under the gun versus under the gun 1 formation at 50 big blinds. It's a very good example here. As you can see, the range comparison here is going to give the pre-flop caller a really big nut advantage, 15% or so against 3%. And while the 3-better does still have plenty of good hands, the donk bet is really effective at applying pressure here. There's about 40% good hands in the 3-better's range, but still 36% in the caller's range. So it's really just going to still be a spot where the caller has a lot of decent hands. And if you look at the overall strategy, the caller is actually donk betting with about 70% of their range here. They're checking 29% and donking the rest. So they're donking a pretty linear construction. You can see here that the best hands are donking at a slightly higher frequency than everything else, and the frequency with each chunk of the range gets slightly lower as we go down from the best hands to the trash hands. But overall, pretty high donk bet frequency. Actually would be kind of reasonable to donk bet entire range here for the under the gun player. And if we look at the indifference threshold for the pre-flop 3-better in terms of what they're supposed to continue with against the quarter pot donk bet, we see that, in fact, it's a lot of the ace highs and king highs and a lot of the pre-flop 3-bet bluffs that are actually pretty indifferent versus this donk bet. So stuff like king queen with 1 spade is actually continuing, but depending on what spade it is, it sometimes folds. Ace king with no spade is kind of mixing, continues. So there's a lot of hands here that just have overcards that are actually able to be targeted for indifference by that quarter pot donk bet sizing. So very interesting spot where a lot of players probably wouldn't think to have donk betting ranges on this board, but it is a spot where it's actually pretty favorable for the out of position player in these situations where their pre-flop calling range is pretty condensed into that region of pocket pairs. Our next category of board textures is anything 9 high or lower with a flush draw, specifically when we're out of position, and in particular when stacks get deeper beyond the 50 big blind mark. As you can see from this graphic, our c-bet frequencies get much lower when the SPR is higher, and they're also lower from the small blind than they are in the big blind, which is a little counterintuitive. The reasoning behind this is that our small blind 3-bet range when deeper stacked is often fairly linear, including a lot of strong Broadway and ace-high combos, and therefore doesn't interact especially well with these low-card boards. By contrast, our big blind 3-bet range often has a lot of high-card, low-card offsuit combos, which can flop some decent pairs on low boards, and it has a much lower density of Broadway cards which miss the flop altogether. A lot of players already intuitively recognize the significance of connected boards in these spots, being much more willing to check at a high rate on something like a 7-6-5 flop, but they may heavily overestimate how much c-betting they're supposed to be doing on a flop like 8-7-3. Let's examine that 8-7-3 board at the 80 big blind stack depth to see why this is the case. Here's that 8-7-3 board from the GTO Wizard solution library. In this case, we're looking at the small blind versus hijack formation at 80 big blinds, like I mentioned. Our c-bet frequency here is about 53%. We're checking 47%, so it's pretty close to 50-50. But what's notable here is that if we look at the range comparison, you can see the ranges are very symmetrical in a lot of ways. Not quite in this region here, which is why we have some c-bets, and then you can see at the top, villain is a little bit ahead with some portion of the range here. But this is a very symmetrical distribution of ranges. And when we're out of position and ranges are going to run very close together, are going to be pretty symmetrical, it's going to incentivize us to have a pretty cautious approach. And you can see here that almost all the combos in our range are mixing c-bets and checks. There's no specific region of hands that's heavily favoring betting or heavily favoring checking. There's a little bit more of a lean towards betting with stuff like jacks, 10s that requires a bit of protection, and a little bit of a lean towards checking with stuff like 7-6, some of the ace highs. But there's really not a lot of pure strategies here. It's a lot of mixing that's going to basically be required. And it's not a board where a medium to large sizing is going to be that challenging for villain because they have a lot of sets, they have position, they have a lot of draws, and it's going to be very tricky for us to navigate and realize equity across multiple streets here. If we were to use a small size, if we just look at the 25% size here, if we were to go ahead and use that, you can see that villain almost never folds. They only fold 12% of the time. And that's one of the reasons why a small size doesn't function very well here. Even with the 75% size, they're not going to fold that much. They're folding 41% of the time, so they're still continuing more than half the time, 60% of the time. They're putting us in a lot of awkward out-of-position spots here across multiple streets, so we just don't really get to do a lot of betting here. We don't really get to do a lot of big betting, and I think a lot of players would be a little bit likely to, even if they don't just range bet these boards, I think it's very easy to over c-bet these boards in 3-bet pots, particularly at depth, and get us into a lot of tough spots as a result. The final category of board textures we're going to look at is the ace-high monotone textures, where the other two cards are both 9 or lower. These boards are surprisingly bad for the 3-better in a lot of formations and tend to be drastically overplayed as a result. If we look at the overall frequency of c-bets in these spots, we can see that there are very few formations where our betting frequency even jumps above 70%, let alone approaching the margin where we might be able to range bet. The main reason for this is the sheer density of the suited Broadway hands in the pre-flop defender's range. They can have plenty of flushes in these spots, as we'll see in a moment, and as a byproduct of this, the 3-better is often going to struggle to play for stacks across 3 streets, even with top set of aces or a hand like ace-king. Our example board for this category is a flop of ace-7-5 all hearts at 50 big blinds effective in the cutoff versus button formation. The first interesting thing here is that the out-of-position player is actually supposed to donk bet at some small rate here. They're only checking 88%, which means they're donk betting about 12% of the time, because it's such a good spot for them. And the reason it's such a good spot for them is if we look here and we actually break the equity buckets down a bit more, we can see that the out-of-position player has a flush 9% of the time, while the 3-better only has a flush 2.8% of the time. So that's partly what's going on here. It's not just about that top region of hands, because the top region of hands isn't just flushes. But if we think purely about the flushes, it's actually more likely, much more likely, that the cutoff is going to have a flush here than it is that the button. And while the button does have a lot of good hands here, including obviously a lot of top pair, a lot of ace-x, some ace-king, ace-queen, etc., especially even some offsuit ace-x that has an ace with a heart, these hands aren't really going to want to play really big pots at any significant frequency, and there's not very many hands here that really do want to play very big pots other than flushes. So if the cutoff does check, the button is actually not going to be able to c-bet that often. You can see here that they're checking 38% of the time, c-betting only about 62% of the time. So it's just not necessarily a spot that's that good for the pre-flop raiser here. They're not going to be able to justify a super aggressive strategy, and even when they do bet, they're using the smallest possible size here of 10% pot. 58% of the time, they are betting that really, really small size. So very small bet sizings are going to be applicable here, but also a lot of checking, and maybe even a tiny bit of donk betting when we're the caller. But the bottom line here is that the caller is much more likely to have a flush than the 3-better in a formation like this. So as a byproduct of that, we just have to be quite cautious on a board like this and not put ourselves in a spot where we end up stacking off with a hand that's way too weak. Our last heuristic here is a strategy which applies to when we're defending against the c-bet as opposed to when we are the c-better. And it relates to one specific category of hands in particular when we're in a 3-bet pot compared to a single raise pot. And that's what I'm going to refer to here as the backdoor wraps. So that's hands which flop 3 to a straight plus 3 to a flush. Now in single raise pots, it's quite common for these hands to never want to fold to a small c-bet because they have too much equity and they have strong implied odds. They'll often be pretty happy to continue passively and mix between raising and calling, particularly if they have overcards. However, in 3-bet pots, we're now in a pretty different spot with these hands for a few reasons. Firstly, our pair outs are less often going to be live because we're up against a higher density of strong hands, which is obviously going to decrease our overall equity. Secondly, the lower SPR is going to reduce our implied odds in the event that we actually do backdoor our way into a strong hand. In addition to that, we're likely to face a lot more aggression on the turn in a 3-bet pot, which makes it harder to realize our equity across multiple streets. And finally, our straight draws and flush draws are more often going to be dominated given the frequency of high-end Broadway hands and strong suited aces in our opponent's range. Here's an example of what I mean. In this single raise pot scenario on a 10-4 deuce rainbow flop at 50 big blinds deep in the hijack versus big blind formation, a hand like Jack-9 of spades here or Jack-9 of hearts with a backdoor wrap plus an overcard is never folding to a 33% of pot c-bet. In fact, the same goes for Jack-8 suited, Queen-9 suited, King-9 suited. A lot of this stuff that wraps around the 10 here, and Queen-8 suited is only folding about 7% of the time. So Queen-8 of spades is pretty much in that same category. If we highlight the spade category over here, we get a bit more insight into it. And we can see that even stuff like 8-6 of spades is indifferent between all three options. So we're definitely continuing with a lot of these backdoors that have some kind of additional equity. 9-7 is in there as well. So we're not really too unhappy, even out of position, against 1/3 at this depth. to continue with these hands because they just have pretty decent equity. If we look at the actual equity of these hands, something like the Jack 9 of spades has 28.6%. However, if we switch over to this 3-bet pot scenario, which is button versus hijack at the same depth, 50 big blinds, same board texture, even against a quarter pot size, the Jack 9 of spades is now no longer really continuing at all. And the same goes for a lot of the other hands in that region. There's some mixing here with the King 9 of spades, but really a lot of the stuff in this region is now just folding. In particular, the middle card stuff is just folding as well. If we filter for just the spades, you can see now that a lot of this middle card stuff that was continuing in the single raise pot scenario that wraps around the 10, that has those double backdoors, they just don't continue here because they're not strong enough. If we look at the equity of those hands, it's gone way down by about 5% here. Jack 9 of spades is now at about 23% equity. So even though we're facing a smaller bet size, we're now folding these hands because their equity has dropped by about 5% in a 3-bet pot compared to in a single raise pot. And that obviously is a really significant margin that's going to heavily alter our strategy with these hands. So backdoors, backdoor wraps, definitely not as strong in a 3-bet pot scenario. So before we wrap up the video, let's talk a little bit about what some of our basic heuristics would be for looking at the turn in various 3-bet pot scenarios. Now, obviously, there are a massive variety of different spots that we could be in here, but let's divide them into a few different categories. The first one is going to be situations where we range bet the flop and then we see a brick on the turn. So in these cases, we're quite often going to want to just use a turn strategy that's based around what you would call a 2E geometric sizing. So 2 equal bets for the remaining streets. And the reason for that is relatively straightforward. It's just because our range is mostly going to want to get all in by the river. And when we're the 3-better and we have a lot of strong hands that are looking to play for stacks, geometric sizing is going to be the most efficient way to do that in most cases. So it's really important that we train ourselves to get a pretty good sense of what a 2-street geometric sizing looks like for each SPR. And a good starting point is to know that at an SPR of 4, a 2-street geo sizing is exactly pot. So you can start extrapolating from there. If the SPR is higher than 4, you know a geo sizing is going to be bigger than pot. If it's less than 4, you know that it's going to be smaller. When we're constructing our turn barreling range, it's pretty important that we use bluffs that don't have a fear of getting check jammed on, because at lower SPRs, check jams on turns are going to happen a bit more. And we really don't want to be in an indifferent spot against the check shove. So we actually have to prioritize certain weaker draws instead of stronger ones. And in particular, we're also more inclined to bluff with hands which allow us to target the folding range more effectively by unblocking the maximum number of folding combos. So sometimes that's going to be hands that are high card, low card combos, like the suited ace wheel hands that have a deuce, 3, 4 in them that doesn't interact with your opponent's range and doesn't block anything from the folding range. And finally, we should avoid going super thin for value on turn for the same reason that we avoid using high equity draws as bluffs. It's because we're probably going to be indifferent versus a check jam in a lot of spots, and that's really a problem. So ordinarily, the thin value portion of our range is going to want to check the turn and then either value bet or just call the river against a bet on a lot of runouts. So these are the basic approaches in these spots where we range bet and see a brick on the turn. Next, we'll consider the category of spots where we use a 2-street geometric size on the flop, so a slightly larger flop size, in particular from out of position, in a situation where we're intending to jam all in on the turn. So a very draw-heavy turn texture where we might have a lot of top-end hands that are quite vulnerable, maybe a board with a lot of straight draws, 2 flush draws, things like that. We might want to take an out-of-position jamming strategy here after using a 2-street sizing, 2-street geometric sizing on the flop. For this type of spot, we're usually going to want to have a depolarized or merged range construction where we're primarily jamming with vulnerable value hands and draws which still have equity when called. And the very top and very bottom of our range are usually going to prefer to check here, since the top doesn't need any protection and the bottom doesn't have any equity when called, so it really cannot jam profitably. The bottom of our range is then going to serve as our river bluffing range if it goes check-check on the turn, which dovetails quite nicely with the fact that we're still going to have some of those trapping hands that checked the turn and are now wanting to value bet or jam the river because they need to get value. So we're still going to allow ourselves to have a solid river strategy after it goes check, check. And our range is going to be constructed pretty well overall as a result. So our turn betting range, our turn jamming range is going to be composed of a lot of strong but not completely nutted value hands, and then some draws that have equity when called. In particular, this is because if we are bluffing with a range of hands on the turn that still has equity when called, then we need to reduce the equity of our value range to compensate for that, because we don't just want to have a very, very strong range that is strong hands and high equity draws, because that makes life easier for villain. It makes it easier for them to fold. So we reduce the equity of our value range, we increase the equity of our bluffs, and we end up jamming a merged range and checking an actually slightly polarized range, but with some bluff catchers in there as well. Finally, we want to consider spots where we're using a geometric sizing as the preflop defender after it goes check, check on the flop. So again, this is a 2E, 2-street sizing. And this is surprisingly common since we're quite often going to be in a spot where the preflop raiser checks back the flop, but we still have plenty of hands in our range that want to get stacks in across 2 streets. Our approach here is going to boil down to some pretty simple principles. We should assume that our opponent's range is going to be somewhat capped, but will include the occasional trapping combo to protect their range if they are a competent player who understands range interactions. And in addition to that, our opponent having very little incentive to jam all in on the turn against a big bet means that we get to bluff with a lot more of our high equity draws, as opposed to the lower equity draws that we have to bluff with when we're in position and we're using a geo size. So from out of position here, if it goes check, check, we can very easily bet those flush draws, those combo draws, because villain has very, very limited incentive to just jam all in when they're the one in position. When they're in position, they have a pretty big incentive to just play call or fold, especially since their whole range is doing a lot of bluff catching, and they just don't really have a lot of hands in their range that would serve as good jamming candidates for value, because mostly they're either trapping or they just don't have that much value to begin with. So for the most part, we can actually have a lot more high equity bluffs on the turn. We don't need to have as many of those lower equity bluffs. And we also don't really need to construct in a way where we have both bets and check raises. In most cases, we just need one methodology by which we're going to get value from the top of our range. It's very difficult for there to be a spot where our value hands have an incentive to check raise, but also other value hands have an incentive to bet. For the most part, we can just look at what the top of our range wants to do, establish whether on this particular turn card, the top of our range has the incentive to check or to bet, and build our value approach around that, as well as having a bluffing range that we build out on top of it. So we don't gain a ton of EV by splitting our ranges and having both bets and check raises, and we don't really need to spend a lot of time on that. So that's about it for this video, a relatively comprehensive guide to 3-bet pots in tournaments, at least particularly with reference to flops and turns. And if you have any questions about this or any of my other content, please do feel free to reach out to me via our Discord server, as I'd be happy to discuss at any time. I will be back soon with another video here on YouTube, and until then, thanks for watching everybody, and good luck to you all at the tables.